Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. At dinner, my daughter-in-law told me that now that my husband was gone, I should grieve, pack my things, and never return. My son simply smiled and gave a quiet nod in agreement. She added that the house had never truly been mine anyway. I left without saying a single word. The next day, I went to the bank, where I was greeted with the words that they were glad to have me there. Follow my story all the way to the end, and share the city you are watching from so I can understand just how far my story has reached. The dining room felt different without Ethan there. The mahogany table, which had seen countless family dinners over the years, now seemed far too large and strangely empty, even though the three of us were sitting around it. My eyes kept drifting toward his empty chair, almost expecting to see him sitting there with his gentle smile and calming presence. It had been exactly 1 week since we buried my husband of 32 years. 1 week since I stood beside his grave, feeling as if half of my soul had been torn away. The grief still pressed heavily against my chest, making every breath feel difficult. Chloe asked for the potatoes, addressing me by name, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. My daughter-in-law had never spoken to me with warmth, but that evening there was something more in her tone, something colder. I reached for the serving bowl, my hand still trembling slightly. The funeral had exhausted me more than I had expected. At 71, I believed I had prepared myself for this moment. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the emptiness that now followed me everywhere. Victor, my 43-year-old son, sat between us like someone pretending to stay neutral, even though it was clear he had already chosen a side. He barely looked at me throughout the evening, keeping his attention entirely on his wife of 15 years. The same son who once climbed into my lap after nightmares now could not even meet my eyes. I tried to break the uncomfortable silence by mentioning that the service had been beautiful, and that his father would have appreciated seeing so many people there. Chloe placed her fork down with deliberate care, and then said that there was something they needed to discuss with me. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. I looked between her and Victor, searching for even a small sign of warmth that should exist between family members who had just experienced a loss together. Instead, I saw calculation in her eyes and discomfort in my son's. When I asked what she meant, even though part of me already feared the answer, she straightened in her chair in that familiar way she used when delivering decisions rather than suggestions. I had seen it before. Whenever she explained why Victor could not visit as often or why family traditions needed to change to suit her preferences. She began by saying that she and Victor had been talking, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness she used when she wanted something. Then she added that now that Ethan was gone, the house would be too much for me to manage alone. I blinked, confused by what she was implying. Too much? I had taken care of that house for over 30 years. I knew every creaky floorboard and every stubborn faucet. She responded by saying that this was exactly the problem, her polite tone beginning to slip. She pointed out that I was not getting any younger, and that maintaining a house of that size was expensive. She continued by saying that she and Victor believed it would be better if I moved somewhere more suitable. Her words felt like a physical, as if they had struck me directly. Move? This was my home. Ethan and I had built our life there. Victor had grown up within those walls. My son finally spoke, his voice quiet and uncertain, saying that she was right and that the upkeep would become overwhelming for me. I told him that I was not helpless, even as my voice wavered slightly. I reminded him that his father and I had spent years saving to buy that house, and that every room was filled with memories of our life together. Chloe's expression hardened as she replied that memories did not pay for utilities or property taxes, and that I needed to be practical. I looked at her, thinking about the woman who had gradually pushed me out of my son's life over 15 years. The same woman who had convinced him that Sunday dinners were too much pressure, and that holidays had to be divided between families, which somehow always meant more time spent with hers. When I asked what exactly she was suggesting, even though I could already feel the answer forming heavily inside me, she said that they thought I should consider moving into one of those pleasant senior communities, describing places filled with activities and people my own age. She added that it would be much better for me than staying alone in such a large and empty house. I turned to Victor, hoping to see even the slightest disagreement. I asked him if he truly believed I should sell the house where he had grown up, the home where his father and I had built our life together. He interrupted, saying that it made sense, still avoiding my eyes. Then he added that he and his wife could make good use of the space, explaining that they had been thinking about expanding their family, and that the house had a lot of potential. At that moment, the meaning behind his words washed over me like a wave of cold realization. They did not just want me gone, they wanted my house, the home Ethan and I had lovingly restored, room by room, over 3 decades. Now that Ethan was gone, Chloe repeated that I should grieve, pack my belongings, and never return. Her voice had completely lost any trace of politeness. She added once again that the house had never truly been mine. The word she used, referring to her father-in-law in Spanish, slipped from her lips with casual cruelty, as if she were talking about getting rid of unwanted furniture rather than forcing out her husband's mother. Victor finally looked up, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something in his eyes, perhaps uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by a small smile and a nod of agreement. He said that she was right, explaining that the house had belonged to his father and now belonged to him, and that I had only been living there. In that instant it felt as though my entire world had shifted off balance. Only living there. Those words echoed in my mind, reducing 32 years of marriage, of building a home and raising a child, into something insignificant, like I had merely been staying temporarily. I responded quietly, saying that I understood, though my voice sounded steadier than I actually felt. Inside, something was breaking apart, not just my heart but everything I believed about my son and the family I thought we were. I rose slowly from my chair, my legs unsteady beneath me, and began to say that I would need some time, 2 weeks. Chloe interrupted immediately, stating that 2 weeks should be more than enough to find another place and arrange for movers. 2 weeks. Not 2 months, not even a reasonable amount of time to grieve and plan, just 2 weeks to take apart an entire lifetime. Victor finally looked directly at me, and what I saw was worse than anger or resentment. It was indifference, complete and effortless indifference to my pain. He said that it was for the best and that I would come to see it that way, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with Ethan, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room still carried the faint scent of his cologne, and his reading glasses rested on the nightstand exactly where he had left them the night before his heart gave out. I sat on the edge of our bed and looked at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman staring back at me seemed older than 71, her silver hair dull and her blue eyes clouded with grief and shock. In 2 weeks I would have to leave this room, the very place where I had said goodbye to Ethan just 7 days earlier. I would have to pack away 32 years of marriage into boxes and hand everything over to a son who had just made it clear that I had never truly belonged there. Yet as I sat there, surrounded by growing darkness, something else began to form beneath the grief and disbelief. It was small but solid, a quiet sense of determination. Ethan had always handled our finances, but he had also taught me to be careful and attentive, to notice the details that mattered. The next day I decided I would begin taking action. I would go to the bank and start understanding exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Victor and Chloe believed they could remove me from this family without any consequences, they might soon discover otherwise. The first step was to learn exactly what Ethan had left behind, and who it truly belonged to. The morning sunlight felt different as it streamed through the kitchen windows. I sat alone at the breakfast table, holding my second cup of coffee. 10 days had passed since that painful dinner, and the house now felt tense, as though it were quietly waiting for my departure. Victor and Chloe had already come by twice, walking through the rooms, measuring spaces, and discussing future renovations as though I were not even there. The day before, I overheard Chloe speaking on the phone with a contractor, arranging estimates for when the old woman would finally move out. During those 10 days, I had existed in a strange state of numbness, going through my belongings mechanically while trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. But that morning, I finally felt ready to face the practical responsibilities Ethan would have expected me to handle. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes along the familiar streets of our neighborhood. I had made that same trip for more than 20 years, usually with Ethan sitting beside me, taking care of our financial matters while I waited quietly. He had always taken responsibility for our finances, not because he doubted me, but because he wanted to spare me the burden of worry. Now I wished I had paid closer attention. Mrs. Whitaker, the bank manager, greeted me with the gentle sympathy often reserved for those who had recently lost a spouse. She expressed how sorry she was to hear about Ethan and spoke kindly of him, remembering how he always asked about her grandchildren. I thanked her softly, appreciating her words more than I could fully express. She said that he had always spoken fondly of me as well. I settled into the chair across from her desk, my purse held tightly in my lap. I explained that I needed to understand our financial situation, admitting that Ethan had handled everything, and that I now felt completely lost. Eleanor's expression softened with understanding as she replied that she would pull up the accounts. She turned to her computer, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows lifted slightly. She reacted with mild surprise, which immediately made my heart jump. For a second, I wondered if Victor and Chloe had somehow already gained access to our accounts. She clarified that nothing was wrong exactly, only that there were quite a few accounts, more than she had expected to see. There was a hint of surprise in her voice. She began by saying she would start with the joint checking account Ethan and I had used for household expenses. She printed a statement and slid it across the desk. The balance was modest but still comfortable enough to cover my expenses for several months if I remained careful. Relief washed over me. At least I would not be left with nothing. She continued by mentioning that there was also a savings account in both our names, handing me another sheet of paper. This balance was noticeably larger, enough to support me for years if necessary. I told her that this was reassuring, feeling some of the tension ease from my shoulders, and added that Ethan had always been careful with saving. She agreed, saying he had been very methodical, though she was still frowning slightly at her screen. Then she said that she was seeing several other accounts that needed verification, explaining that some appeared to be in my name alone. She asked when I had last reviewed my full financial portfolio with Ethan. I repeated her words in confusion, saying that accounts in my name only did not seem right, since Ethan had always managed everything. Eleanor's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard again as she explained that, according to their records, there were 4 additional accounts: 2 certificates of deposit, a money market account, and a trust account that had been established 5 years earlier. My head began to spin as I admitted that I did not understand any of this, since Ethan had never mentioned it to me. She then asked carefully whether my husband had ever expressed concerns about our family situation, explaining that sometimes clients set up separate accounts as a form of protection. The question caught me off guard, and I asked what exactly she meant by protection since I did not understand. She hesitated slightly, choosing her words with care, and explained that when clients have complicated family dynamics, such as concerns about inheritance disputes or outside pressure, they sometimes take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security. I thought about Ethan's behavior over the past few years. I remembered how he had begun asking more direct questions about Chloe's spending, how he had grown quiet whenever Victor spoke about financial difficulties, and how he had insisted on handling all our banking personally, never allowing Victor to come along even when our son offered. I asked her to tell me more about these other accounts, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor printed several more pages and explained that the first certificate of deposit had been renewing annually for 7 years, while the second had been opened 3 years earlier. She added that the money market account had been receiving automatic transfers from our joint checking account, small amounts about $50 at a time, but consistently over the years. She handed me the statements, and the numbers seemed to blur before my eyes. These were not small emergency savings. They were large sums of money, enough to buy a house, enough to live comfortably for decades. I asked how this could be possible, explaining that I had never knowingly signed anything. She gently told me that I had, in fact, signed the documents, pulling out a file folder to show me. My signatures were there on all the paperwork. She explained that Ethan had likely brought me in to sign documents, probably presenting them as routine banking updates or insurance forms. I stared at the papers in disbelief. There was my signature dated and witnessed on forms I did not remember signing, though looking at the dates I could recall some of those visits, the time we updated our address after the house numbers changed, and the occasion when we switched to a different type of checking account. I said quietly that he had never told me what I was actually signing. She responded carefully that this was not uncommon, explaining that some spouses prefer to handle the details to avoid causing stress or confusion, and that legally everything was in order. The accounts she confirmed were fully mine. I tried to take in what this meant. While Victor and Chloe were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations, treating me like something to be removed, I had financial resources they knew nothing about. She then added that there was one more thing, her voice even more cautious. The trust account she had mentioned had been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years, an account connected to Caldwell Construction. I explained that Ethan had sold the business when he retired and that Victor had said the money from the sale had barely covered debts. She checked her screen again and said that, according to their records, the business account was still active, with regular deposits followed by transfers into my trust account. She then told me that I should speak with the business accountant, explaining that there might be more to my financial situation than I realized. I left the bank in a daze, my purse heavy with account statements and printed documents. Instead of driving straight home, I pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe and remained in my car, going through everything Eleanor had given me. The numbers did not lie. Somehow, without my knowledge, Ethan had been carefully protecting me. Every account, every investment, every trust had been arranged to make sure I would be financially independent. As I examined the trust account statements more closely, a pattern began to appear. The deposits matched Victor's visits over the past 5 years, larger amounts appearing after he had asked his father for small loans, or when Chloe had hinted at their financial difficulties. Ethan had been giving our son money, but at the same time, he had been setting aside an equal or even greater amount for me. It was as if he had known that one day I might need to rely on myself. My phone buzzed with a message from Victor. He wrote that Chloe had found a realtor to list the house, and that they could begin showings the following week. He added that he hoped I was making progress in finding somewhere else to live. I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked back at the bank statements resting in my lap. Victor and Chloe were so confident, so certain that they controlled everything. They had no idea that their plans were built on something they did not fully understand. The next day, I decided that I would call the business accountant. I needed to find out exactly what else Ethan had left behind. After that, I would decide what to do with the knowledge that my husband had cared enough to make sure I would never be dependent on anyone. The grief was still there, sharp and present. But beneath it, something else was beginning to grow. A quiet strength I had not felt in years. The office of Hayes & Associates was located in a small strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax service. I had never been there before. Ethan had always handled the business meetings himself, saying it was dull paperwork that would only give me a headache. Now I understood that he had been protecting me from more than just boredom. Eleanor Hayes appeared to be around my age, with steel gray hair tied back neatly and kind eyes behind thin-framed glasses. She had managed Caldwell Construction's accounts for over 15 years, and when I had called the day before, her tone had been carefully neutral. She greeted me and gestured toward a chair across from her desk. She offered her condolences, saying that Ethan had been a good man and an honest businessman, and that she would miss their regular meetings. I thanked her and admitted that I wished I had understood his business life as well as she did. I sat down, keeping the bank statements safely in my purse, and explained that I was trying to understand our financial situation. I mentioned that the bank had told me about ongoing business income that I had not known about. Her eyebrows lifted slightly as she repeated that I had not been aware. She said that this was unusual, adding that Ethan had spoken about me often, and she had assumed. She stopped herself, reconsidering her words. I told her that I needed to understand what had really been happening, explaining that my son believed the business had been sold years earlier and had barely covered its debts. She looked genuinely confused and said that the business had not been sold, but restructured. Turning to her computer, she pulled up the relevant files and explained that 5 years earlier, Ethan had transferred ownership of the company's assets into a trust, the Caldwell Construction Trust, and that I was listed as the primary beneficiary. For a moment, the room seemed to shift around me. I asked if that meant I owned the construction company. She clarified that the trust owned the company and that I, in turn, owned the trust. She added that the business had been doing quite well. Ethan had been very selective with contracts after the restructuring, focusing on smaller, reliable projects that provided steady income, rather than the unpredictable nature of larger commercial work. She printed several documents and handed them to me, explaining that they were the profit and loss statements for the past 5 years. The company had been generating consistent revenue. I looked at the numbers, my hands trembling slightly. The yearly profits were significant, more than enough to explain the regular deposits I had seen in the trust account. I said quietly that Ethan had retired and was no longer working. She explained that while he had stepped back from daily operations, he had continued overseeing the business and making major decisions. She added that the construction work itself had been managed by Andrew Langley, asking if I knew him. I nodded. Andrew had worked with Ethan for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and eventually becoming a foreman. He had attended the funeral and had been one of the few people who seemed genuinely affected by Ethan's passing. She continued by explaining that Andrew had essentially been running the company for the past 5 years. Ethan had arranged it so that Andrew received a percentage of the profits as a performance incentive, which had kept him both motivated and loyal. She said that it had been a very successful arrangement. I asked why Ethan had never told me any of this, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. She said that it might not be her place to speak on this, but explained that Ethan had been concerned about family pressure. He had mentioned that my son was struggling financially, and that his wife had expensive tastes. Ethan had worried that if the family became aware of the ongoing business income, there would be expectations and demands that could threaten my future security. The pieces began falling into place with painful clarity. Every time Victor had asked his father for money, every time Chloe had hinted at how comfortable we seemed, Ethan had been carefully balancing how to support our son without putting my independence at risk. I said quietly that he had been protecting me, the realization heavy in my words. Eleanor gently replied that he had been protecting both of us in different ways. She explained that the loans Ethan gave to Victor over the years had been significant, but they came from the business operating account, not from my personal funds, and that he had documented everything carefully. She took out another folder. She explained that these were copies of all the loan agreements between the business and my son, and that Ethan had insisted on treating them as formal transactions, with structured payment schedules and interest rates. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Page after page of loan documents appeared, each one signed by both Ethan and Victor. The amounts were overwhelming, tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, supposedly for Victor's various business efforts and investments. I asked whether Victor had been making payments on those loans, though I already suspected the answer. Eleanor's expression became uneasy, as she explained that the payment schedule showed significant delays. As of the previous month, the total outstanding balance, including interest, was approximately $87,000. The number struck me like a physical blow. Victor owed the family business, my business, nearly $90,000, while at the same time claiming that his father had left nothing but debt. I asked what would happen to those loan obligations now. She explained that they transferred along with the business assets and that, as the new owner of the trust, I had the legal authority to demand repayment or adjust the terms as I saw fit. I thought about Victor and Chloe walking through my kitchen, measuring spaces, discussing renovations, and deciding when they would begin showing the house. They had been so confident, so certain that everything Ethan had built now belonged to them. Eleanor then said there was something else I needed to know, her tone becoming even more careful. She told me that the previous month, my son had contacted her directly. He had claimed that, after his father's passing, he would be taking over management of the business. He had even asked her to prepare documents transferring ownership, but she had told him she would need written authorization from the trust beneficiary, from me. She added that he had seemed surprised to learn that I was involved in the business structure at all. So Victor had already been planning to take control of the business, just as he intended to take the house, assuming I was too overwhelmed with grief to understand what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than I had expected. I told Eleanor that I needed to ask her something confidential. I asked whether it would be possible to keep the current structure in place, with Andrew continuing to manage operations. She immediately said that it was absolutely possible. She added that Andrew had actually been hoping to hear from me, and that he was worried about the future of the company and his own job security. If I chose to keep things as they were, she believed he would remain reliable and deeply appreciative. I gathered the documents, my thoughts racing with everything I had just learned. The business belonged to me. The large debt Victor owed was real and legally enforceable. And neither he nor Chloe had any idea that their plans were based on assumptions that were about to collapse. I said that I wanted to schedule a meeting with Andrew as soon as possible, and that I also needed to understand all my options regarding the unpaid loans. She agreed and asked if she should contact Andrew that same afternoon. I said yes, and added that I would appreciate it if our conversation remained confidential for the time being. She assured me that confidentiality was a fundamental principle in her profession. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with another message from Chloe. She wrote that the realtor wanted to arrange a photographer for the next day, and instructed me to make sure the house was clean and uncluttered, emphasizing that first impressions were important for potential buyers. I looked at the message for a long moment before putting my phone away without replying. Let them organize their photos. Let them imagine their future in my house, spending money they believed was already theirs. They had no idea that everything they were counting on was about to fall apart. That evening, I sat in Ethan's study for the first time since his passing, surrounded by his carefully arranged files. Now I understood why he had been so precise with his records, why every transaction had been documented so carefully. He had been building protection around me piece by piece, and the next day I would begin to understand just how strong that protection truly was. The following morning, Andrew Langley sat across from me in my kitchen, his worn hands wrapped around a coffee mug. At 55, he still had the strong build and rough hands of someone who had spent his life working in construction, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that I had never noticed before. He spoke honestly, his voice carrying emotion, admitting that he had been deeply worried since Ethan passed away. He explained that Victor had visited the job site the previous week, talking about reviewing assets and making operational changes, and that it did not sound promising for people like him. I poured myself another cup of coffee, following the familiar routine to steady my nerves. I asked Andrew what exactly my son had told him. He explained that Victor had said the family was facing financial difficulties, and that some difficult decisions would need to be made regarding the business. He had also asked for a complete list of current contracts, equipment, and cash flow projections. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. He added that Victor had also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the office. I asked what he had told him. Andrew replied that he had said he would need to speak with whoever was actually in charge now. He reminded me that Ethan had always told him that if anything ever happened, he should wait for proper instruction from the legal owner. Then he looked directly at me and said that Ethan had never mentioned Victor in that context. Relief spread through me. Ethan had prepared for this, making sure Andrew would protect the business instead of handing it over to someone simply claiming authority. I told Andrew that I needed to share something with him, but that I needed his word the conversation would remain private for now. His expression became serious as he gave me his word. I laid out the documents Eleanor had given me the day before. I explained that I owned Caldwell Construction, not Victor, not the estate, but me. Ethan had transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago, and I was the beneficiary. Andrew's eyes widened as he looked over the papers. He reacted with surprise, apologizing for his language, and said that Ethan had always been thinking ahead. I agreed and pointed out that, according to the records, the business had been performing very well under his management. A look of pride crossed Andrew's face as he explained that they had built a strong reputation with steady clients, quality work, and fair pricing. He added that Ethan had always said repeat customers were more valuable than any single large project. I told him I wanted things to continue exactly as they had been. But I said I needed to understand something. Victor had not been entirely honest about the family's financial situation. I asked if he could tell me about any interactions he had had with Victor regarding business matters. Andrew's expression darkened. He said there had been several over the years. Victor would come around when Ethan was not there, asking about cash flow and upcoming payments from clients. A few times, he had suggested that the business might be able to provide temporary funding for investment opportunities. I asked what he had told him. Andrew replied that he had always said Victor needed to speak with his father. He added that he was not naive and could see what was happening. His tone grew firmer as he mentioned that, the previous year, Victor had come to the bank on the same day they deposited a large payment from a project. Victor had claimed it was a coincidence, but he had shown a strong interest in the deposit. My stomach tightened. It became clear that Victor had been watching the business income, likely trying to time his requests for money when the funds were highest. I told Andrew that I needed complete honesty and asked whether he believed Victor understood how much money the business had actually been generating. Andrew was quiet for a moment before answering. He said that Victor probably knew it was more than what the family had been told, but that he likely did not understand the full extent. Ethan had been very careful to keep business and personal finances separate, at least on paper. I asked what he meant by that. Andrew explained that Ethan had been strategic. When Victor asked for help, Ethan would say the business was struggling or that margins were tight, but he would still find a way to help, usually by structuring it as a loan from the business account instead of using personal funds. Andrew then pulled out a small worn notebook. He explained that he kept records of everything, a habit Ethan had taught him. According to his notes, Victor had received payments totaling about $93,000 over the past 5 years. The amount was even higher than what Eleanor had shown me. I repeated the word payments, not loans. Andrew clarified that this was exactly what he meant about Ethan being careful. On paper, everything had been structured as loans, complete with payment terms, but those terms had never really been enforced. Victor would miss payments and Ethan would allow it. I said that meant Victor believed he owed nothing. Andrew corrected me, saying that Victor acted as if he owed nothing. Whether he truly believed it or simply chose to act that way was unclear. At that moment, I heard a car door slam outside. Looking through the kitchen window, I saw Victor's car parked behind Andrew's truck. I said quietly that my son had arrived and that I did not want him to know we had been discussing business matters. Andrew nodded and quickly gathered the papers. He told me that whatever I decided to do, he would support me fully. He added that Ethan had trusted me enough to put everything in my name, and that was all he needed to know. Victor walked in without knocking, something that would have bothered Ethan, but something I had learned to tolerate over the years. He greeted me in the morning, barely looking at Andrew, mentioning that he had not expected anyone to be there. I replied smoothly that Andrew had stopped by to check on me, reminding him how thoughtful he had always been. Victor responded briefly, but his attention had already shifted. His eyes moved across the kitchen as if he were assessing it for resale. Then he added that he was glad Andrew was there, because they needed to discuss the business situation. Andrew's expression turned carefully neutral. Victor explained that with his father gone, there would need to be changes, and that the family had to make practical decisions about assets and ongoing responsibilities. I watched the exchange closely. Victor was so confident, so certain of his authority. He did not realize he was trying to claim something that had never belonged to him. Andrew asked what kind of changes he meant. Victor said they would need to evaluate whether it made sense to continue operations, or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts. His tone remained casual, as if he were discussing something trivial. Andrew responded that he understood and then asked who would be making those decisions. Victor hesitated slightly, clearly not expecting the question, before saying that the family would decide and that he would be handling his father's business affairs going forward. Andrew repeated the idea carefully, placing a slight emphasis on the word referring to Victor. Victor then turned to me and suggested that I make fresh coffee, dismissing me the way he always had when conversations became important, saying that he and Andrew needed to discuss technical matters. But this time I did not move. For the first time in years, I stood my ground and said that I would stay, reminding him that it was my kitchen and that Andrew was my guest. Victor looked surprised but eventually shrugged and continued. He instructed Andrew to prepare a full inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. He also said he would need access to the business accounts to review the financial situation. Andrew replied carefully that he would be willing to assist and asked who he should coordinate with for authorization. Victor answered that it would obviously be him. Andrew then asked whether he had the legal authority to access the accounts. Victor's confidence wavered slightly as he explained that he was Ethan Caldwell's son and heir. Andrew acknowledged that and asked whether he had documentation proving he was authorized to act on behalf of the business. The kitchen fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Victor's face tightened as he struggled between irritation and uncertainty. He responded in a condescending tone, saying that Andrew did not understand the situation, insisting that he was simply trying to organize his father's affairs and ensure everything was handled properly, but that this would be difficult if Andrew continued to question him. Andrew replied evenly that he was not trying to create problems, only to understand whose instructions he should follow, reminding him that Ethan had always been clear about procedures and documentation. Victor then turned to me, expecting support, and said that I should explain that he was now handling the business matters. I looked at my son, the man who was planning to sell my home, who had accumulated nearly $90,000 in debt while claiming nothing had been left behind, and I made my decision. I said quietly that Andrew was right to ask for proper documentation, and reminded him that his father had always been careful about such things. Victor stared at me as if he could not believe what he was hearing. He asked what I meant. I explained that everything needed to be handled properly and legally, and that he should understand the importance of that. For the first time since the conversation began, Victor looked uncertain, and as I watched that uncertainty appear, I felt something I had not felt in years: control. The phone call came early in the morning, 3 days after my confrontation with Victor in the kitchen. I had been expecting it. When you question someone's assumed authority, there are consequences, especially when that person is used to getting their way. Victor said sharply that we needed to talk immediately, and that he and Chloe were coming over. I remarked that it was rather early, but he insisted it could not wait and said they would arrive in 20 minutes before ending the call. I took my time getting ready, choosing a navy blue dress Ethan had always said made me look dignified. If this was going to be a confrontation, I intended to face it properly. They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Chloe's heels striking the porch with sharp, deliberate steps. I opened the door before they could knock, keeping the small advantage of greeting them as the hostess in my own home. I welcomed them calmly, as if it were an ordinary visit. Chloe moved past me into the living room, holding her designer purse tightly, while Victor followed with a grim expression. They both remained standing, positioning themselves between me and the door in a way that felt deliberate. Victor began by saying he did not understand what I thought I was doing, explaining that Andrew had called the day before and refused to provide business information without proper authorization. He demanded to know what I had told him. I settled into Ethan's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. I told him that I had instructed Andrew to follow proper procedures, just as his father would have expected. Chloe's voice rose sharply as she questioned what I meant by proper procedures, insisting that Victor was Ethan's son and heir, and asking what more authorization anyone could possibly need. I replied calmly that I meant legal authorization, the kind that comes with actual ownership. Victor's eyes narrowed as he asked what I was talking about. He said that his father's will left everything to the family and that, as the executor, he handled all assets until probate was settled. I told him that this was not entirely accurate. I reached for the folder I had placed on the side table, the one containing all the documents Eleanor Hayes had given me. Victor and Chloe both tensed as I opened it. I explained that Ethan's will did indeed leave his personal possessions and the house to the family, but Caldwell Construction was not part of his estate and had not been for 5 years. Victor demanded to know what I meant. I pulled out the trust documents and placed them on the coffee table between us, explaining that Caldwell Construction had been owned by the Caldwell Construction Trust since 2019, and that I was the sole beneficiary. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe reached for the documents first, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the legal language. Victor leaned over her shoulder, his face growing pale. She said it was impossible, insisting that I knew nothing about business and had never even handled finances. I agreed that I had not, explaining that Ethan had always taken care of those things, but that he had clearly understood aspects of our family situation that I had been too unaware to see. Victor sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. He insisted that the business had been struggling, that his father had always said margins were tight and barely enough to keep operations running. I explained that the business had actually been quite profitable, and handed him the financial statements for the past 5 years. Watching Victor's face as he processed the numbers made everything clear. He spoke quietly, asking where the money had gone. I told him that some of it had gone to him, quite a significant amount. I pulled out the loan documentation and stated that it amounted to $87,000 over 5 years. Chloe grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning them quickly. She pointed out that they were listed as loans and reminded Victor that he had told her they were gifts meant to help them get established. Victor insisted that they had been gifts, but his voice lacked conviction, saying that his father had never asked for payments or even mentioned any schedules. I said quietly that there were records of everything, every conversation, every missed payment, and every time Ethan had chosen to extend the terms rather than demand what was owed. I watched as the reality of their situation began to settle over them. Victor had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He had likely made commitments based on money he believed was already his. Chloe suddenly insisted that none of this changed anything, her voice turning desperate, saying that the house still went to Victor and that it was worth more than the construction business. I asked calmly if that was really the case. Her expression shifted between anger and panic as she said the house was worth at least $400,000. I agreed that it was a beautiful property but reminded them that there was also the matter of the mortgage. Victor looked up sharply and asked what mortgage, saying his father had told him the house was fully paid off. I explained that it had been, but that 18 months earlier Ethan had taken out a home equity loan, a substantial one. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I had discovered in Ethan's study just the day before, carefully filed in a folder marked emergency funds. I explained that the loan was for $350,000, and that the funds had been transferred into the Caldwell Construction Trust account, meaning they were now part of my assets. Chloe's face went pale as she said that could not be possible and insisted they would have known. I explained that Ethan had been the sole owner of the house at the time, and although I had survivorship rights, I was not listed as a co-owner, so no additional signatures had been required. Victor stared at the loan documents as if they were written in a language he could not understand. He asked why his father would do such a thing, why he would mortgage the house just to move money into a business account. For the first time since the conversation began, I allowed my carefully controlled emotions to show. I told him that Ethan had done it to protect me, to ensure that no matter what happened, I would always have financial security. Victor asked, his voice strained, what exactly I needed protection from. I gestured around us and said it was from this. From being forced out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person, from being left with nothing while others claimed what they believed they deserved. Chloe's composure finally broke as she accused me of manipulating Ethan and convincing him to change everything. I told her that Ethan had not been dying when he created those trusts. He had been planning, and the fact that he felt the need to prepare for such a situation should say something about how he saw our family. Victor's hands were shaking as he set the papers down. He said that surely we could work something out, suggesting that I did not really want to manage both the business and the house, and that the house should remain in the family. I told him that it was remaining in the family, it was staying with me. Chloe asked desperately how I planned to manage the mortgage payments. I explained that I would handle them exactly as Ethan intended, using income from Caldwell Construction. Andrew Langley had assured me the business was stable, and Eleanor Hayes had confirmed that the cash flow would easily cover the loan payments, with plenty left over for my living expenses. I stood up, smoothing my dress. I said calmly that I believed he had mentioned something about moving out, and that it still sounded like an excellent idea. Just not for me, of course, but that I was sure they would find somewhere suitable to begin again. Victor looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. He questioned how I could be serious, bringing up everything his father had done for me and what the family was supposed to mean. I interrupted and said that his father had indeed done everything for me. I explained that Ethan had loved me enough to make sure I would never be dependent on anyone, including my own son, and that now I finally understood how necessary that protection had been. Chloe was already standing near the door, her face tense with anger and disbelief. She insisted that this was not over, and that they would fight it and challenge everything. I replied calmly that they were free to try, but that everything Ethan had done was entirely legal and properly documented. I added that Eleanor Hayes had already provided copies of all relevant documents to my lawyer. Victor paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. He said that he did not understand why I was doing this to them. I told him that I was not doing anything to them, I was simply refusing to allow them to do it to me. After they left, I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my house, and felt something I had not experienced in decades. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was completely financially independent. I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what belonged to me. Ethan had given me more than financial security. He had given me freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage, watching the morning sun cast golden light across the Pacific. The sound of the waves against the rocks below had become part of my daily life, replacing the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house. The cottage in Mendocino was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every detail of decoration, every room reflected my own taste rather than compromises made over 32 years of marriage. To my surprise, I discovered that I had excellent taste when no one else was offering opinions. Caldwell Construction continued to do well under Andrew Langley's management. He called every Friday afternoon to update me on current projects and upcoming work, and the quarterly profits were deposited directly into my account. I had kept my promise to maintain the business exactly as Ethan had arranged it, and everyone involved seemed to benefit from the stability. The cottage itself had been an unexpected discovery. While looking into properties along the California coast, I learned that Ethan had purchased it 3 years earlier through the construction trust. Eleanor Hayes had found the deed while organizing business records, along with a note written in Ethan's hand saying it was for my retirement, when I was ready for ocean air and a life without schedules. Even after his passing, my husband was still taking care of me. That morning, however, was important for another reason. My lawyer was coming to finalize the last remaining matter from my previous life. Victor and Chloe had indeed attempted to challenge the trust, hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and financial disputes. It had not worked in their favor. The investigation confirmed that all of Ethan's financial arrangements were completely legal and properly executed, and that Victor's debt to the business was even greater than originally calculated. With interest and penalties included, the total had reached just over $96,000. The doorbell rang precisely on time. Daniel Whitaker, who was not related to Eleanor from the bank, was known for his punctuality and professionalism. He had represented me throughout this entire situation, and his steady competence had been invaluable. He greeted me politely and sat in his usual chair near the window. He explained that he had brought the final settlement agreement for my review. I poured coffee using the French press I had learned to use, another small symbol of independence in my new life, and sat across from him. I asked how Victor and Chloe had reacted to the final terms. He replied with controlled amusement, explaining that their lawyer had argued extensively that family obligations should outweigh business agreements, but that the law was very clear regarding debt. He handed me the documents. After 6 months of legal negotiations, Victor and Chloe had agreed to terms that recognized the full amount of the debt and established a payment plan that would take 8 years to complete, assuming every payment was made on time. They made one final attempt to negotiate forgiveness based on family ties. Daniel continued, explaining that Victor had actually broken down during the final meeting, saying that I was destroying my relationship with my only son over money. I asked what he had told them. He replied that he had reminded them he was representing my financial interests, not my family relationships, though he admitted he had also pointed out that most mothers do not have to take legal action against their children to recover legitimate debts. The settlement included a condition that gave me a certain sense of reassurance. If Victor and Chloe failed to keep up with payments, the business had the legal right to garnish Victor's wages and place liens on any property they might purchase. It was a safeguard that ensured I would receive what was owed, regardless of their future decisions. Daniel then said there was one more thing and handed me a separate envelope that had arrived the previous day. The handwriting on it was Victor's. Inside was a short note written on plain paper. He wrote that he knew I might never forgive him for fighting me on this, but that he wanted me to understand that he finally saw what his father had been doing. He admitted that it had taken losing almost everything for him to realize how much he had taken for granted. He explained that he and Chloe were now attending marriage counseling, and that he was working 2 jobs to keep up with the payments. He added that he hoped that one day, I might be willing to speak with him again and apologize for everything. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The apology felt sincere, I could recognize that, but it had come 6 months too late and seemed driven more by consequences than true understanding. Daniel asked if I wanted him to pass along any response. I told him no. If Victor wanted to rebuild a relationship, he would have to do it the same way he would repay his debt, slowly, consistently, and over time. After Daniel left, I took my coffee out onto the deck and read Victor's letter once more. The grief was still there. Not only for Ethan but also for the son I believed I had raised and for the family I thought we had been. But beneath that sadness, something stronger remained. A quiet sense of satisfaction that I had stood up for myself when it truly mattered. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, yet it seemed vaguely recognizable. The caller introduced herself as Diane Hayes, Eleanor's daughter, and said she hoped it was all right that she was calling. I remembered her. A nurse at the regional hospital whom Eleanor had mentioned occasionally. I told her it was fine and asked how I could help. She explained that she was starting a support group for women who had experienced financial manipulation by family members and wondered if I would be willing to share my experience. The request surprised me. I admitted that I was not sure what I would even say. She responded that many women found themselves in similar situations. Adult children feeling entitled to their parents' assets, spouses hiding financial details, families mistaking kindness for weakness, and that my story might help others understand their rights and find the strength to protect themselves. I considered her words for a moment, watching a pelican dive into the water below. 6 months earlier, I had been a grieving widow on the verge of losing everything at the hands of my own son. Now I was financially independent, living exactly where I wanted, answerable only to myself. I asked when she would like me to speak. She sounded surprised but pleased. I told her that if I did it, it would not be about revenge or legal battles. I wanted to talk about the difference between being a loving family member and allowing oneself to be taken advantage of, about understanding one's own financial situation, and about the protection Ethan had given me, even from our own son. We arranged the meeting for the following month. After the call ended, I realized that helping other women in similar situations felt meaningful. A way to honor both Ethan's foresight and my own hard-earned independence. That evening, I followed a routine I had adopted since moving to the cottage. I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, allowing myself to fully appreciate that this view, this peace, this freedom belonged entirely to me. No one could take it away. No one could remove me from my own life. No one could decide that I no longer mattered. The cottage was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the ocean and the distant calls of seabirds settling for the night. The next day, I planned to tend to my garden or perhaps drive into town for lunch at the small bistro where the owner always saved me a table by the window. Simple pleasures that were entirely my own. Victor's debt would eventually be repaid, whether through his efforts or through enforced collection. The legal agreement ensured that justice would be carried out regardless of his choices. But the real victory was not financial. It was the realization that I had finally found the strength to demand the respect I deserved. As the last light slowly disappeared from the sky, I lifted my glass in a quiet toast to Ethan, wherever he might be. He had loved me enough to make sure I would never be helpless, never forced to depend on the mercy of people who saw me as something disposable. And he had loved me enough to ensure that when the moment came, I would have everything necessary to face it. The ocean carried on its endless rhythm against the shore. And I remained there in my own home on my own deck, living my own life, at last understanding what true freedom meant. It meant never again having to ask for a place at a table that had always been mine by right. It meant peace. Now, I find myself wondering about you, the one listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever experienced something like this? Share your thoughts below. And on the final screen, I'm leaving 2 more stories that are among the channel's favorites. They might surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the end.